Hey geographers, this is Miss B and welcome back. We are in Unit 2, which is Population and Migration Patterns and Processes. So, totally new unit, and hopefully the background can give you a little hint as to where we're going. Alright, so before we start, let's do a little bit of thinking. So, what do you think you'll be learning when you hear the words population and migration patterns and processes? Write your answer down in the section in your EdPuzzle for those of you that are my students. So go ahead and do that now. I would love to see your answers. Alright, so our newest topic for today is 2.1, and we're talking about population distribution. So basically how the population or how people are distributed or spread across the planet, right? Okay, let's go. So this is our learning objectives and our essential knowledge that we're going to be going through in this lesson. However, I want to just put it in layman's terms for you. So but your challenge for this particular lesson is to identify the factors that influence distribution of human populations at different scales, define the methods geographers use to calculate population density, and then be able to explain the differences between those the population densities and the impact of the methods used to calculate population density. So you have a big challenge for this lesson, but I think you'll be able to do it by the time we're finished. Okay? All right. So first off, we need to know about countries. So there are least developed countries, and according to the United Nations, least developed countries are low-income countries confronted with severe structural impediments or problems that to sustain their development. Okay, meaning that they have a very hard time upholding their society because of low income status. Okay, as it says there, they're very vulnerable to economic and environmental shocks and have low levels of human assets. Human assets means anything that would help to propel the society economically speaking. Okay, so any resources or anything like that would help to propel the society economically. And examples of LCDs or least developed countries are Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Okay. And now we have more developed countries. More developed countries, or MDCs, are also called industrialized countries. And those countries have a mature and sophisticated economy, which is usually measured by the gross domestic product, or the GDP, and the average of the income per resident. So in this case, more developed countries have a highly sophisticated economic system, and that economic system and the resources that they have truly support and advance the society so that it gets bigger and more grander, right? So MDCs, some examples of MDCs are the United States and Canada in Anglo-America, as you see here in this map, right? Europe, Japan, and parts of Oceania, right? Australia and New Zealand, parts of Oceania. And there's also some parts of the Middle East as well. Not entirely. The entire Middle East is a LCD, because there are certain places like Saudi Arabia that's very rich in oil deposits and oil distribution, and that's where we get our resources for our gas. So not all countries in the Middle East are LCDs. In this case, Saudi Arabia is an MCD, right? All right, so let's continue. All right, so demography is the study of human populations. Okay, and basically geographers use this information on demographic analysis to study the distribution of humans over the earth and how we move as well. Okay, so the size and the composition and the growth of a country's population definitely affects its well-being. So depending on how big it is, the size, how it's composed, and also how it is growing in terms of whether it is an LCD or MCD, It depends on the well-being and the survival of that particular country. Okay, so as you see here in this map kind of shows the population of India, and there's certain places that's very close to the capitals, right, that are highly dense. Okay, and there's a lot of people per person per kilometer in those certain areas, right? So it kind of lets us know what the demography is in that area in terms of how people take up space in those areas or in those places, and kind of asking the question, why did they take up space in those areas? All right. So population distribution is the distribution of a population and this pattern across the pattern of people across the earth. Okay, so basically we're looking at the pattern of how many people are placed or living in certain places on the earth. Okay, and usually populations are often clustered or concentrated near things that are sustainable, like water and farmable land. Arable means farmable. Okay, so population concentration regions, there's usually 4 regions that display the same similarities. It's usually near some form of water or river or some kind of easy access to the ocean. Okay, usually there's some form of fertile soil, and there's also some type of climate that is temperable, meaning that you can, it's livable. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, you know, and it's not too warm, those kind of things, right? And there's differences in the patterns of the occupancy on the land itself. So it's not just that it's highly concentrated in all the areas. There may be spots where it's sparse, and sparse means that there's not that much, and then there's areas where it's highly concentrated. As you see here in the map, there's certain areas, especially in India and in China, where it's highly concentrated, right? And some places in Europe, and then other places where it's not so concentrated at all, right? There's barely anybody. Okay, so that's called population distribution. All right, so if we look at population distribution, some of the places that are highly dense in population are East Asia and South Asia. And reason for that being is that a lot of this area, historically speaking, like in India and in these areas here, this is what was called the Fertile Crescent. Okay, and a lot of the population started around the areas ancient wise, along the rivers and valleys and so forth that helped to draw water, right? So in East Asia, here we have the Yangtze River and the Yellow Rivers that help to provide water and food, right? In South Asia, which is India and so forth, major people just clustered around major cities, around the coast, and along the rivers so that they can get food. Okay. However, there are physical barriers such as mountains and maybe other valleys and canyons or something like that that would separate populations and create physical barriers between populations, so they may not thrive as much. So in this case, if you look at this map, the Himalayan mountains, which is a region right here, kind of makes that separation between the clusters or the concentration of the population in certain areas. There's not much here, but there's a lot. There's a lot here, right? Because number one is close to the ocean, and two, the Himalaya mountains is kind of making that that barrier of living in this area, right? All right, so Europe is the 3rd largest concentration, and because this is related to the deep coal deposits that happen, or they're used during that time, and that helped to explode or to help to develop Europe during the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. So the more that they were able to use that coal to fuel things like the steam engine and to help build massive industrial buildings and so forth to help them with textiles and cloths and other types of resources that we use on a daily basis. That's how Europe was able to really escalate in its population and also have a high concentration of people, as you see here in the map, right? Then fourth, of course, is North America, and a lot of the urban areas stretch from the East Coast to mostly on the East Coast, so from Washington, D.C., and in the Boston area, and of course, you know, New York City has a lot of high concentration of people, right? All right. However, there are places that are sparsely populated. So before we talked about densely populated, so population density where there's a certain concentration of people in certain places on Earth, right? But however, there are places that are sparsely populated, meaning that there's not much people there. And the reason why there's not much people there is because, number one, it's too dry. There's not enough water. Nobody wants to live where there's no water, right? Or it's too wet, or it's too cold, or you just can't get there. It's just too mountainous, right? If there's basically a way not to be able to support any form of food like agriculture to grow crops, or we can't get water, then more than likely that's a place that we're not going to live, okay? For example, we're not going to live in Antarctica. It is way too cold. The penguins can have fun there, but not us, okay? However, that's not always the case. There are some exceptions to this rule where there's densely populated areas, but then you have the places that are not so populated, like up here in Alaska and the Siberian area. But there are exceptions. So there's nomads that live in the Sahara Desert, and they adapt as much as they can, especially or Eskimos that live in Alaska, the Native Americans that live in the Amazon rainforest in these areas. So they figured out a way to kind of adapt to their environment, right? A little bit of possibilism. So if you remember that from the last unit, that's incorporating that term, right? Hey, so I know this is a lot to chomp on, so take a few minutes, get a break. It's time to regather yourself, and we're gonna head right back into the lesson or the topic for today.